So thank you very much to Naomi, to the Living Cities Forum, Andrew, Sam, David, and all of the team. I've watched this forum develop into one of the most vital spaces for discourse on the city, so it's really an honor to be here today. Thank you. I'm going to talk about a project that we're hoping to include in the Sharjah Architecture Triennial. Okay. The Mabo ruling is often described as a landmark decision, but it merely admits in legal form what to everyone was already an indisputable fact: that Australia was inhabited before it was colonized, and therefore that these original inhabitants had claim to land. Mabo is often credited for overturning terra nullius, a Latin phrase that translates as nobody's land. Most of us were taught that it formed the legal pretext for British settlement of this continent, but we were taught wrong. The term terra nullius doesn't really appear until the 19th century, over 100 years after the arrival of the First Fleet. What Mabo overturned then was not only a moral and a legal fiction, but a historical one too. The continent was not settled, it was conquered, and the conquerors knew it. Terra nullius was a fig leaf cast back in time, eventually taken for a truth. The lies that linger around our history are many. One of the most pernicious is that Indigenous Australians lived in a state of subsistence. According to this image of pre-colonial Indigenous society, life was little more than a harsh, unending struggle to satisfy primordial needs out of meager opportunities. It's a more pernicious lie because, well, it's one thing to admit to conquering, another to accept that the conquered were your equals. Pre-colonial Indigenous Australia did not exist in a state of subsistence. The time allocated to ceremony and ritual is already proof of this. Moreover, as the work of people like Bill Gammage and Bruce Pascoe make clear, this was no primordial state of nature. The continent was designed. Its ecologies were modified, its rivers were controlled, its fields cultivated, its movements, cycles, and rhythms harnessed and manipulated in a grand choreography spanning hundreds of communities and their different language groups and lasting tens of thousands of years. How's that for an image of Australia? A vast, intergenerational, multi-ethnic design project at the scale of an entire continent. White Australia couldn't recognize it, still can't, despite the evidence that piles up year by year. Eventually, though, it too will become an indisputable fact. Take a recent piece of research on the veracity of oral history. The researchers recorded 21 Indigenous stories and myths along the coast of Australia, all of which accurately corroborated historical sea levels. Now, that might seem unremarkable, except that the sea levels being described were between 7,000 and 18,000 years old. That is, an empirically verifiable story accurately transmitted across 300 to 700 generations. Who gets to tell stories about Indigenous Australia is a story in itself. I hope I manage to get across what I mean by that in what I'm about to tell you. So the Sharjah Architecture Triennial is the first major international exhibition of architecture to focus on the Global South. The theme of the inaugural edition, of which I'm the curator, is rights of future generations, and it really invites us to think about the relationship between three things: architecture, climate change, and colonialism. It's a big, ambitious exhibition. It is research-based. There are over 40 newly commissioned works from across the world, a publication series, a public program. And in the midst of all of this, I hope to show a single work from Australia. The work I'm referring to is a painting. One day, it will be recognized as the most important painting in Australia's history, perhaps also as one of the most important paintings in the world. Right now, it's rolled up in a box in an art centre in northwestern Australia. And how it came into existence is a rather astonishing story. So in 1993, on the back of the Mabo decision, the National Native Title Tribunal was established. The claims process is designed to prioritise negotiation and to encourage parties to take responsibility for the resolution of native title proceedings without the need for litigation. The Native Title Act states explicitly that the crucial function of the tribunal is to facilitate mediation between Indigenous groups and other claimants, for example, state governments or private parties. That is, once Indigenous claimants have demonstrated title to the land, the law hopes that the claimants will negotiate agreements with these other parties, whether for compensation or for future rights. These agreements are referred to as Indigenous land use agreements. The High Court may hear or review cases where the tribunal fails to facilitate agreement between the parties. But going to court is time-consuming. It typically takes over a decade to reach a conclusion, and it's very costly, usually over tens of millions of dollars. In 1998, the Liberal government under John Howard passed the Native Title Amendment Act, which significantly modified and limited the original act. And its purpose, the purpose of the amendment, was to protect the interests of pastoral leases, the pastoral leases that cover about 44% of the Australian continent. Or more accurately, perhaps, the amendment was designed to preempt and to limit the ability of Aboriginal Australians to test native title against pastoral leases in the High Court. Can Indigenous concepts of rights and duties to speak for country, to take care of country, be made commensurate with concepts of property, contract, and evidence of land tenure? In Australia, the state is the sole source of law. That law consists of public, verifiable statements, in the case of property claims, maps, surveys, and deeds, are privileged kinds of statements for establishing the truth of tenure under Australian law. But Australia has another legal order in which the state is not the only source of law, where the law is orally transmitted rather than written, a law that values secrecy and initiation rather than public statements. Absent of maps, surveys, and title deeds, how do native title claimants establish the grand choreography of modified ecologies, the control of rivers, the cultivation of fields, the cycle and seasonal rhythms harnessed and manipulated and lasting tens of thousands of years? The Native Title Act, then, is revolutionary insofar as it brings two radically different legal orders into contact. Their encounter raises difficult questions, important questions about the past, present, and future of relationships between Black and white Australia. In 1993, a group of communities from the Great Sandy Desert met at Lampu Well on the northern end of the Canning Stock Route to explore making a native title claim in the aftermath of Mabo. Kimberley Land Council chairman and one of the Noongar claimants, Ivan McPhee, explained to those assembled that under native title, the claimants would have to prove our culture, our law, our traditional law, where we come from and who we are, where we walked on the land. For the next 4 years, in working alongside the anthropologist Daniel Vachon and the manager of the Mankaja Art Centre, Karen Damon, the communities would return to country and try to define the area that would be subject to their native title claim. But the question would remain, how to establish in front of an Australian legal tribunal their culture, their law, where they came from, who they were. In other words, what in the eyes of the native title tribunal would constitute proof of land tenure going back generation after generation. And then they made a most startling decision. They decided to make a painting. So this is images of the saltwater collection, which is the first time that a cultural artifact is used in a native title claim in Australia. So it would be the first and so far the only time in the history of the Australian legal system that a painting would be entered as proof of land tenure. Not only this, but the group of artists would have to decide what kinds of stories and what kinds of law to share with each other, and then what kinds of stories and what kinds of law to share with the Australian Native Title Tribunal. After agreeing that they would produce a collective painting, the group of artists make a second startling decision as to the contents of the painting. I think this is just incredibly intelligent and strategic. They decide to paint something that was common to all 4 communities, to all 4 language groups in the claimant area. They decide to paint waterholes, or jilla. The claim area they would seek to establish native title over was 83,886 square kilometres, or just over twice the size of the Netherlands. So in 1997, on the 9th of May, and after 4 years of meeting, study, and discussion, a group of over 40 Aboriginal men and women from the Walmajiri, Wankajunga, Mangala, and Juwalini communities and language groups get together at the Panini Outstation, about 6 days' drive south of Fitzroy Crossing in the Great Sandy Desert. The plenary session with the Native Title Tribunal is just 10 days away. They made camp, they set out the canvas, and they prepared their materials. Then the next day, on the 10th of May, Jimmy Pike takes a brush and makes the first mark, drawing the line of the Canning Stock Route from one edge of the canvas to the other. The artists find their country and begin painting. In early April this year, a group of us travelled to Fitzroy Crossing to meet with the surviving artists and nominated descendants of the deceased artists responsible for the painting. We had spent the last 7 months conducting as much research on the painting and the hearing as possible from London. We spoke to John Carty from the South Australian Museum, Karen Damon from the Mankaja Art Centre, Fred Cheney, who was the Deputy Chair of the Australian Native Title Tribunal, Michael O'Donnell, who was the Principal Legal Officer of the Northern Land Council, and to Kirsten Anker, a legal anthropologist whose paper, The Truth in Painting, first alerted me to the existence of the Noongar canvas, thereby lodging a splinter in my mind for years to come. We went through court records, surveys, newspaper articles, documentaries, anything we could find to make sense of the project from the rather distant perspective of the Royal College of Art. But we also knew that we had gone as far as we could, that despite a considerable amount of research, all we had were a series of hunches and intuitions, ones that were formed at a great distance. So I wrote to Karen and asked her whether it would be possible to come to Fitzroy Crossing to meet with the artists in order to tell them about the aspirations of the Sharjah Architecture Triennial and then to listen to their aspirations for the painting. So we were jubilant on receiving a response from Karen indicating that the artists were willing to meet with us and that they would be available in early April. A group of us, my brother, Michael McMahon, who is a researcher, an Indigenous Australian, who's also an architect, studying at the Royal College of Art, and a research assistant on the Sharjah Architecture Triennial, went to Sydney, caught a flight to Perth, caught a flight from Perth to Broome, hired a car at Broome, drove 400 kilometres inland to Fitzroy Crossing to the art centre. So then at 1 p.m. on Thursday, the 4th of April, in the Curryilly Education Centre in Fitzroy Crossing, 21 people gathered to discuss the project. So 16 of them were either the original artists or, since many of those have passed away, descendants authorized to represent the respective parents or relatives that contributed to the painting. For many, it was the first time that had gathered together as a group since the 20th anniversary of the painting in 2017. So many of them had traveled quite a distance to attend the meeting. We were very pleased to see each other. I have to say, sitting in that room filled with so many senior elders from the communities represented in this painting, in the same room as so many great artists, many approaching the latter years in life, was really one of the most humbling or inspiring experiences I'll ever have. Terry Murray, where's Terry? Terry's there. Terry opened the meeting with a minute's silence for all the loved ones who had passed and could not be there. And so from the very start, and before anyone even said anything, the entire idea of intergenerational rights being more powerfully expressed just in the assembly itself. I followed and I tried to explain that the feeling we felt during that minute's silence spoke to an understanding of how much of our world, both individually and collectively, our landscapes, our environments, our beliefs, is received in some state from parents or ancestors or other kin, and that the theme of the entire exhibition was to imagine that this intergenerational relationship is at the very heart of climate, environmental, and land rights struggles. I explained that I believed that extractive relationships jeopardize this legacy and that the reason we were interested in sites of Indigenous struggle was because they presented us with examples of alternative spatial and social legal orders. And I thought there was a lot to learn from these kinds of encounters. Karen Damon, you see here, put together some images showing the history of the painting and its production. It was very moving. Everyone made us stop on every single slide. Everyone in the room pointed out images of their younger selves or pointed to parents, aunties, and uncles involved in the painting. It was an indescribably intimate moment, and I almost feel reticent sharing it with you today, except that the humor, love, the dignity and pride on display in that room was really at the core of what this painting has made manifest in the world. And there are a couple of really extraordinary moments from that discussion. I just want to share them with you. The first, so after describing some of the other projects that were taking place in the exhibition and explaining how they represented different sites of land rights struggle or environmental action through an intergenerational lens, Dylan Andrews, who's the person there in the Akubra, turns to me and asks me whether those other mob in the exhibition care about their country too. And of course, I immediately replied, yes, they did. And in the middle of explaining one of the examples, he kind of cut me off and he said, no, that's okay, we just need to know. And I was thinking about it afterwards, and it's the first time that an artist ever asked me about the kinds of values represented by the proposals put forward by the other exhibitors in a way that suggested this would figure in their decision-making, right? We could talk about why that is later, but I think it was also really interesting. I mean, for me, at least, it confirmed that the importance of this exhibition, or indeed of any exhibition, is simply to try to deploy the resources and infrastructure of an institution at the service of processes that have a much longer lifespan, and to see if we can use those resources and that infrastructure to give those processes some momentum. A second moment was when Jocelyn, you can see here on the right, asked in genuine fear what might happen were the canvas to be lost or damaged in transit. And she expressed it like this. She said, "This," referring to the painting, "is our country. It's the only country we have left." i.e. that the canvas, the stories, the kin are one and the same, but also that the canvas is the most important, perhaps the only surviving link that many in the younger generation have to their elders. So from the perspective of London and the university and the curatorial team, we had all kinds of intuitions and hopes and imaginations about the project, as you do for any project. And while many of our intuitions and imaginations were generally sound, at least in this case, the reality of the work really exceeded my wildest imagination. And I would never say that I understand the work in any way close to the sense that the owners and of these communities do. But being there and meeting with these people and seeing their pride and their love for it and each other, seeing the history of struggle and humor on all their faces, has given us some small glimpse of the edges of its importance. And that glimpse has been awe-inspiring. So the Sharjah Architecture Triennial is an attempt to work through what it means to decolonize the architectural exhibition. Now, for that to happen, it is important that the curatorial process, as much as the content of the exhibition itself, becomes a site of reflection. Think about the way that so-called non-Western works figure in architectural exhibitions. They're either hopelessly condemned to repeat the kinds of cliches and stereotypes of the vernacular on one hand, or else they reinforce a kind of white savior in which European and North American architects travel to the developing world and do good by building schools and hospitals. And from one perspective, many of those kinds of projects have what people call architectural merit. That is to say, they make use of innovative spatial layouts or structural systems or combine materials in original ways. But if we expand our frame of reference and consider the political economies that support these kinds of projects, another kind of picture emerges. Because what we often find is that these projects are funded by Western aid and development programs through NGOs. The circulation of images in these projects, in Western European or North American exhibitions adds cultural capital to those offices, which they then convert into financial capital, basically by monetizing these circulations in order to get more funding for more projects from NGOs. Because the directors and the employees of these offices are mobile and connected to major cultural and educational institutions, they are uniquely positioned to take advantage of the circuit of capital production. The problem is that this is completely disempowering for local architectural cultures. And as a curator working from the Royal College of Art for the Sharjah Architecture Triennial, working in conditions of the Global South, we have exactly the same question. So in the context of the Sharjah Architecture Triennial, an architectural exhibition of the Global South, an exhibition on architecture, as Andrew mentioned at the beginning, not just of architects, in which many of the projects are produced by people who are not in a position to capitalize on the circulation of images, who are not in a position to capitalize or to monetize the kinds of values that emerge from international exhibitions. Important kinds of questions arise. What do participants stand to gain for having their work included in a show? It's clear what we stand to gain as the curators, but what use do others have of architectural exhibitions? Take this project, this canvas. The painting is priceless, so it's never going to be sold. Its value will increase as a result of exhibiting it. But how does a community in northwestern Australia benefit in practical terms from that increase in value? If we don't manage to answer those kinds of questions, then we end up repeating the extractive mode of existence this exhibition sets out to critique. And of course, what that does then is it prompts a reflection, a self-reflection about the way we think about exhibition making, about the way we deploy institutional infrastructure, the way we deploy resources to empower the communities that we're working with in return for giving us the permission to show their work. So this is some images of the artists putting their painting together in May in 1997 at Panini. And that's Nugara too. It's so much more than a painting. It's a strategic intervention in a land rights claim, one that adapts traditional laws and stories about country to produce legal and political effects using aesthetic means. That makes it completely singular in the already rich and complex tradition of Indigenous Australian cultural production. On one hand, it's kind of a map in the cartographic sense, since it still might be said to point to things. On the other hand, it is far more than a representation. Indeed, it is, in a very material, in a very literal sense, country, as those involved in painting it have always pointed out. It is the expression of law and the way rights to tell stories about country are differentiated among different members of the community. It's a historical narration of the emergence of the landscape. It is a site for ceremonies of cleaning, maintaining, and awakening. It is the embodiment of kin and the home of ancestors. It's a carpet. You can stand on it. You can dance on it. They let their dogs walk on it. It is a plan, both in the literal sense of marking out spaces for the artists' bodies to sit and to paint their respective sites. It is also a plan in the more profound sense of an intervention that attempts to shape a future action. It is all these things and more. It is the most unique, multivalent object, likes of which I have never encountered. And there's an excellent story about a curator, a very well-known Australian curator, who travels to Fitzroy Crossing. Curator will remain nameless, and he sees the artists standing on top of the painting, just testifying to the various histories within the painting, and he's completely furious. And he says to them, "You're going to have to decide what it is." And I think it's beautiful because, of course, it's exactly its undecidability, that makes it so confronting and so provocative for Western European understandings of aesthetic production. So, the artists insist that the hearing takes place on country. And so with the painting completed on the 19th of May under a tent and a series of tarps in Panini in northwestern Australia, the Australian Native Title Tribunal assembles to hear evidence on Cogolo versus State Government of Western Australia. Fred Chaney, you can see here, the Deputy Chair of the Native Title Tribunal, arrives at the plenary conference with John Clark, a taciturn representative of the state government of Western Australia, and 2 other government employees. The canvas is unrolled before the tribunal. Testimony is given by a number of artists, including Warford Pujiman, Spider Snell, Njuyu Stumpy Brown, Pajaji Peter Skipper, Nada Rawlins, Nanijan Charlie Nunjun, Palun Happy Bullen, Jakuna Mona Chaguna, and Kulyuku Trixie Shaw. When they are called to testify, they walk over to the canvas, they stand on the part of the canvas that is their country, and speaking in one of the 4 different language groups of the claimant communities, they explain their culture and their law, they explain where they came from and who they were. It was, one tribunal member said, the most eloquent and overwhelming evidence that had ever been produced. Ten years later, in 2007, the determination. So in 2007, 10 years after that plenary session at Panini, Justice Gilmore of the Federal Court of Australia returns to deliver the determination. Were they successful? Of course they were. In the course of the determination, the judge says the following: "Can I say that in making these orders, the court does not give you native title. Rather, the court determines that native title already exists. It determines that this is your land and that it has always been your land." So now we're in the midst of trying to find a way to take an 896 kilogram crate measuring 8.25 meters long, 1.2 meters tall by 0.9 meters wide from its storage in the Munkajah Art Centre in Fitzroy Crossing to the Sharjah Art Foundation in the United Arab Emirates. And if all the kinds of things you need to do to get these projects to fall into place, we also hope to bring the canvas and 20 of the artists and their descendants from Fitzroy Crossing to Sharjah for the opening of the Architecture Triennial for an awakening ceremony during the opening week. The project is the key to understanding the entire exhibition. We're also hoping to commission a new piece of work that speaks to the role of the canvas as proof of land tenure within the native title claim to exhibit alongside the painting. Most importantly, we want to try to do these things to use the vehicle of the exhibition to support the Nurara artists, culture, country, and stories so that future generations in Australia and across the world might come to better appreciate their astonishing achievement. Thank you.